Hi. You're listening to Karl-Mikael Seiding's AI Alter Ego. This podcast is created based on my own writings, primarily from Substack. Spreadser AI focuses on investments in mental, physical, and financial health. Topics range from pure investment cases, which of course should never be considered financial advice, to my experiences and advice on training, nutrition, and sleep. In between, I talk about consciousness, meaning, free will, politics, science, psychedelics, perspective and meaning, and whatever I think can help make you become happy, productive, fulfilled, basically realize your full potential, or bliss out on purely hedonistic pursuits. You can actually read the podcast content too, on my Substack, if you're a premium member or during a 1-week free trial. Click the link in the show notes. If you're interested in more in-depth investing skills, you should check out theinvestingcourse.com. TIC, theinvestingcourse.com, meaning myself, is sponsoring this podcast. It's a 6-week online course where I teach how to find, analyze, invest, and evaluate publicly listed stocks. There is a Swedish version as well. The links are in the show notes. It's our pleasure to welcome Andrew Gallimore, author of Death By Astonishment, Confronting the Mystery of the World's Strangest Drug. Andrew's book presents the first detailed account of the discovery of DMT and science's ongoing struggle to explain how such a simple and common plant molecule can have such astonishing effects on the human mind. His book explores the contributions fascinating characters from the scientific and literary worlds have made to the DMT narrative, including the legendary ethnobotanist Dr. Richard Schultes, the renegade beat writer and drug aficionado William S. Burroughs, and the philosopher and raconteur Terence McKenna. Andrew delves into the profound realm of mystery and astonishment found in the DMT state, introducing the story that begins in the Amazonian rainforests and ends somewhere beyond the stars, forcing us to reconsider our most basic assumptions about the nature of reality and our place within it. Although much of my adolescence was spent cultivating exotic and supposedly psychoactive plants and herbs under a small grow lamp hung awkwardly beneath a desk in my bedroom, I was, by modern standards at least, relatively late to the psychedelic party. I did not have what I would consider to be a proper psychedelic experience until my early 20s. It was barely 3 years since Terence McKenna, who had already become something of an idol of mine, had made his final transition into the great mystery, and I, then a young PhD student with a deep interest in psychedelics but very little practical experience, hopped on the train from Cambridge down to the beautiful Roman city of Bath in the southwest of the United Kingdom to attend my very first psychedelic symposium. Most of the 3-day event, an eclectic mix of psychedelics, philosophy, and astrology, is now something of a blur, but it was the final evening, once the formalities had been concluded, that holds permanent residence in my psyche. While most of the speakers and other attendees had drifted off elsewhere, perhaps a dozen or so of us wandered to a park by a river for a final, less formal summer gathering. Among that motley crew was MAPS founder Rick Doblin, who ambled into the assembled circle, lugging what appeared to be a large Tupperware tub, and sat down on the grass just a few feet away from me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he finally cracked open this mystery box, neatly packed with the finest examples of fresh Psilocybe cubensis I had ever seen. This was during a less authoritarian era, when fresh, unprepared magic mushrooms were perfectly legal under United Kingdom law. He began to pass the plump phallic fungi around, and a particularly juicy pair found their way into my hands. Although I had not planned on consuming anything beyond the bottle of cheap red wine I had bought from a nearby off-license, this seemed like as good a time and place as any. I slowly began to nibble them down. From my prior 4 years as an undergraduate student, I was reasonably familiar with the powerful rushing sensation as a drug. Mainly one prominent member of the phenethylamine family got to work on my central nervous system. But this felt different. It was as if every cell in my body had become electrified, and this energy then coursed through my entire being, intensifying until I could sit still no more. I rose unsteadily to my feet and wandered among a small clutch of trees at the edge of the park. Then I noticed something both entirely new and yet somehow familiar. I can only describe it as stepping into a fairy tale. What would in sober waking life have appeared as a perfectly unremarkable collection of trees became instead an enchanted wood. Yes, if I were to describe my first mushroom experience in a single word, that would be enchantment. At the time, I was not particularly interested in the deeper meaning or philosophical implications of psychedelics. Questions about the ontological status of alternate realities, non-human discarnate intelligences, machine elves and the like, that would come to dominate my work in the decades that followed. Psychedelics simply seemed to provide a direct path back to that enchanted wood, back to a magical enchanted world. While I had been fascinated by the chemistry and pharmacology of psychoactive drugs for several years prior, it was that first bemushrooming in Bath that cemented my desire to understand how these drugs interfaced with the brain to achieve their effects on consciousness. But it was another psychedelic experience just a few years later, with a different but closely related naturally occurring molecule that, rather than ushering me gently into the forest of the enchanted, would drag me with violent force into direct confrontation with another type of emotion I thought I understood, and yet, as it turned out, was also entirely new. I first heard about DMT, dimethyltryptamine, several years before my mushroom munching with Rick Doblin from Terence McKenna, naturally, but that was long before powdered mimosa hostilis root bark was a thing in psychedelic circles. Unless you had access to a particularly well-stocked dealer or were part of a well-connected in-group, which I was not, DMT was quite hard to find. When the opportunity to take DMT finally arrived a few years later, having primed my brain with all the stories of elves and imps, jesters and jokers, reptilian and insectoid aliens, the mischievous, magical and menacing creatures that would surely greet me on the other side of the veil, I knew exactly what I was expecting to see. But it was nothing like I expected or imagined. If I were to describe the experience in a single word, it would not be enchantment, but pure, bright white, absolute astonishment. Terence McKenna was right when he said that astonishment is not merely rare, but perhaps the rarest of emotions. I am talking here about true astonishment, not the watered-down version that acts as a synonym for the merely somewhat shocked or surprised. I dare say that few ever experience true astonishment, and yet DMT delivers it on tap. Anyone who has ever gotten a full breakthrough hit of DMT knows that his famous warning of the risk of death by astonishment, which was obviously the only acceptable title for my new book about DMT, does not feel like hyperbole. As the molecule slipped into my brain, I was not greeted by an enchanted version of the normal waking world, but another world entirely. Of course, I had no idea where or what this world was, but in those moments, as the molecule seized and overwhelmed me, although McKenna's elves were nowhere to be seen and the insectoids remained out of sight, it was undeniably apparent to me that I had somehow found myself in an alternate reality constructed by the hand of an immense and timeless alien intelligence. And if I'm honest, it horrified me. A world not merely strange but transcending the imagination in its utter and absolute alienness, irresistible in its construction and undeniable in its presence. Of course, I was far from the first to be left reeling and aghast by DMT, but for the first time in my life, I was presented with what appeared to be a true mystery, something that did not seem possible. To me, at least, this was big news, a substance of massive import, with the potential to completely transform our understanding of reality and our place within it, perhaps the most profoundly important, world-shattering discovery we've ever stumbled upon as a species, something that ought to have been howled from the rooftops. And yet, as eloquently vocal as McKenna was in his repeated insistence that DMT is the strangest, most intense, beautiful, bizarre, and inexplicable state of consciousness a human can experience this side of the yawning grave, the mainstream scientific community's reporting was decidedly muted. In the wake of that first DMT trip, as I eagerly graduated from online trip reports to the academic journals, I was not greeted by scientists throwing up their hands and declaring this the next great mystery to be tackled by humankind. Instead, in the more mainstream journals, DMT was described in mundanely disappointing terms. a highly visual psychedelic comparable to psilocybin and LSD, albeit with a much faster onset and shorter duration of action. What about the hyper-technological cityscapes and alien civilizations? What about the machine elves jabbering in an indecipherable tongue and singing impossible objects into existence? Nothing. It made no sense. Science clearly had not gotten the message, or if it had, failed to grasp its significance. This lackluster appraisal of DMT in scientific circles is hardly new. In its pure form, DMT was unleashed upon the Western mind in 1956 by Hungarian physician Dr. Stephen Zara, who synthesized the molecule himself and, in the spirit of the times, established its remarkable visionary properties by injecting it into his own bloodstream. Psychologist David Luke and I interviewed Dr. Zara just a few years prior to his passing, eager to hear what he made of the strange non-human creatures that appeared in his first studies of DMT in human subjects. But he had little to offer, admitting that when experiences such as God, strange creatures and other worldliness appeared, as psychiatrists they simply classified them as hallucinations. For most psychiatrists working with DMT at the time, and indeed since, that attitude was standard. A hallucination is a hallucination is a hallucination. To me, this was obviously not the case, but it seems most were simply not interested in the structure and content of an experience, so far beyond anything connected to the human condition. It was not until Dr. Rick Strassman began studying DMT in the 1990s, the largest study of its kind ever conducted, that the phenomenology of DMT got the full science treatment. All 60 of his volunteers received pure DMT at several dose levels via intravenous injection, and their trip reports were carefully recorded in bedside notes that later formed the basis of his magnum opus, DMT, the spirit molecule. Even after Strassman's work made it abundantly clear, at least to me, that DMT was doing something far from easy to explain, few mainstream scientists seemed to take it seriously beyond noting it as a particularly intense, short-acting psychedelic with the propensity to induce visions of non-human entities, as if that alone weren't remarkable. Even now, 3 decades after Strassman's study, it's not difficult to find scientists, most of whom I assume have never taken DMT, slotting the DMT state into neatly demarcated phenomenological categories that make its effects seem easier to explain than they really are. A cognitive neuropharmacologist referred to encounters with non-human, non-animal entities as illusory social events, or ISEs for short, apparently hoping his coinage would catch on. If he really thinks interactions with superintelligent alien beings are social events, I'd very much like to know the kinds of parties he attends. To anyone who's had such an encounter, ISE sounds simply silly. Another neuroscientist published an article titled, "No, DMT aliens aren't real," insisting that just because it feels real does not mean it is, and declaring anyone who doubts this is absolutely wrong. He attributes machine elves and other hyperdimensional denizens to depolarization of pyramidal cells that attenuate thalamocortical circuits and disrupt thalamic afferents, causing a perturbation in functional connectivity of cortical and subcortical regions. He admits this sounds like scientific doublespeak nonsense, and it does because it is nonsense, offering nothing in the way of real explanation while giving the impression it does. This self-congratulatory sophistry, masquerading as explanation, is not limited to the hard sciences, but also finds its way into the softer side. Some suggest that consulting the mid-20th century psychoanalyst Carl Jung provides clarity. Yes, the machine elves and their hyperdimensional housemates are, we're told, archetypal imagery bubbling up from the collective unconscious. While I do not deny the existence of a collective unconscious or the archetypes within it, I reject the notion that they explain DMT's effects. Invoking Jung's collective unconscious allows anyone to dismiss any otherwise inexplicable phenomenon as archetypal or an autonomous fragment of the psyche, avoiding the possibility that DMT's reality-transforming effects might be truly mysterious and worthy of genuine inquiry. The collective unconscious is a magician's hat from which any inexplicable phenomenon can be extracted with an awkward flourish. Once invoked, No further explanation is required. Well, I'm sorry, but that is far from sufficient. We must admit DMT remains a true mystery, not a curiosity to be casually explained away. In Death by Astonishment, I recount the experience of a Korean man who contacted me after a terrifying encounter with malicious insectoid aliens during an ayahuasca session in Peru that left him convinced they'd captured his soul. To him, the reality of those creatures was not academic. His very soul depended on it. I also present two previously unpublished reports from Strassman's 1990 study, so horrifyingly alien that one volunteer plunged into hypertensive shock and almost died, saying, "It was like hell because there was nothing human. I was being mined, devoured by strange alien forces." I doubt either volunteer would have patience with talk of dream imagery, archetypal symbols, or neo-Jungian psychobabble. My purpose in writing Death by Astonishment was twofold: to introduce newcomers to DMT's history and science's struggle to explain its world-switching effects, and to convince those more familiar that making sense of it is indeed a struggle. DMT represents a true enigma. Here is the basis of my argument, consistent for over a decade. The world you experience, whether awake or dreaming, is constructed by your brain as a model fashioned from neural information. The brain evolved to build a single subjective world, stable, predictable and familiar, yet dynamic and responsive to sensory input. We can explain dreaming as a selective simulation of waking life, drawing on stored concepts and experiences while disconnected from sensory input. We can explain how psychedelics make the familiar world break down, become fluid and novel, and why certain imagery influenced by memory and archetypal patterns emerges. But when the normal waking world is not only obliterated, but replaced entirely by one bearing no relation to the world left behind, worlds populated by hyper-intelligent, non-human, discarnate entities with no referent in waking life, coherent, higher-dimensional realms more real than reality, of crystalline clarity and impossible complexity, then we have a problem. In constructing the DMT worlds, it's almost as if the brain uses a language it never learned, building models it never learned to construct, and doing so flawlessly. Its ability to fabricate these non-human worlds in exquisite detail and dynamic complexity is at least as confounding as a 5-year-old British child waking up with frosted mini-wheats and offering a measured perspective on 20th century Sino-Russian relations in fluent Siberian Yupik. One explanation for these encounters is that we are interacting with intelligence external to the brain, that DMT gates access to an alternate source of sensory inputs directing the bizarre worlds we experience. While modern scientists almost universally reject this, we might find that if we truly want to understand DMT, rather than explain it away, we must reassess that assumption. Indigenous peoples of South America and beyond have claimed for millennia that DMT-based plant preparations facilitate communication with discarnate intelligences. It's difficult for the post-Enlightenment mind to accept that more primitive cultures might have been onto something long before us. In Death by Astonishment, I discuss the work of Stephen Sara, the McKenna brothers, Tim Leary, Bill Burroughs, and many others, analyzing and ultimately rejecting orthodox explanations for DMT's effects. I emphasize the foundational importance of shamanistic peoples who developed true pharmacological technologies, what Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro called visual prostheses, to render the hidden visible and establish relationships with these beings as we do with each other. If we take seriously that DMT grants access to true discarnate intelligence, and I argue in the book why we ought to, then DMT is more than another psychedelic. It's a technology we are now charged with carrying from its forest roots, carefully, respectfully, and optimistically, into a future beyond our imagination. Earlier this morning I spoke with Dennis McKenna on his podcast about the frustration of making sense of messages from these immense intelligences in the DMT state. What could all these hyperdimensional elfin machinations mean? Why can't they just give it to us straight? Where are the equations for the grand unified theory? Where are the blueprints for the time machine? In the end, we both converged on the same position. Perhaps we are far from ready for the big message. Perhaps blueprints for intergalactic spacefaring vehicles aren't in our or anyone else's best interests. To truly understand DMT and the realms it reveals, we must first absorb and take to heart the simplest yet most important message, one uniquely difficult for us hominids drenched in self-importance to accept. Get over yourself. You don't know shit. Endorsements for Death by Astonishment. Dennis McKenna, Ph.D. DMT is unique among all the psychedelics in that it affords access to an alternate reality that seems every bit as real as our ordinary reality and yet is utterly alien. With the possible exception of Terence McKenna, Andrew Gallimore has been investigating this longer and more thoroughly than anyone else. I believe he may have cracked the code. His conclusions are astonishing, and to some, they will be horrifying. This book is not to be missed. Rick Strassman, M.D., Adjunct Associate Professor of Psychiatry, University of New Mexico School of Medicine, and author of DMT, The Spirit Molecule and My Altered States, an exhilarating yet rigorously grounded account of DMT's rapidly increasing influence on human consciousness. What if an unimaginably powerful psychedelic molecule made in the human brain could be harnessed to reliably provide contact with super-intelligent beings from other dimensions of time and space? Gallimore's project provides an essential understanding of this nascent field and its implications for our species' evolution. David J. Brown, author of the Illustrated Field Guide to DMT Entities, compulsively readable and impossible to put down, Death by Astonishment is a page-turning odyssey into the enigmatic history of the world's strangest drug. Bringing together many of the most pivotal stories in psychedelic history, Gallimore not only connects the dots, but also fills in the missing pieces, shedding new light on the mysteries of this extraordinary molecule. Graham St. John, author of Strange Attractor, The Hallucinatory Life of Terence McKenna, MIT Press 2025. Peeling away the many layers of one of our greatest mysteries while leaving intact the enigma at its core, combining the erudition of a scholar and the precision of a scientist, Andrew Gallimore leads a fascinating inquiry into the heart of the unknown. Don't forget to check out theinvestingcourse.com. Read some of the raving reviews there and join the waiting list for the next cohort. Standing in line is free. I've had 0 complaints on the course and about 1,000 out of 1,000 satisfied participants. Even if some at first have thought that the fee's a bit steep, $1,000 is a price only people serious about their money are ready to pay for leveling up their investing skills. Everybody felt they got their money's worth several times over after the course. Links in the show notes. Investing in yourself, including your finances, is about enabling as durably meaningful a life as possible. This is Karl-Mikael Seedings AI signing off. See you again in a few days.